Today, we will explore the dynamic interplay between the button and the small blind in 3-bet pots. Our focus will begin with pre-flop ranges and then shift to post-flop strategy. Starting with the button's opening moves, in a standard 6-max game at 100 big blinds deep, the button typically opens with around 44% of hands. This range is expansive, leveraging the positional advantage inherent to the button. When the button opens with 2.5 times the big blind, the small blind faces a strategic decision. Interestingly, direct calls from the small blind are relatively infrequent, occurring in only about 1.25% of hands. The more common response is a 3-bet, executed with approximately 14.28% of hands. The 3-bet size typically ranges from 9 to 12 big blinds, with 11 big blinds being a common choice. The small blind's 3-betting range is extensive. It primarily includes pocket pairs, ranging from 6-6 through aces, suited broadways, strong suited connectors, like 10-9 suited, a variety of suited aces, such as all ace-5 suited, some ace-4 suited, ace-7 suited, and large offsuit broadways. Ace-10 offsuit, some king-jack offsuit, king-10 offsuit, and all king-queen offsuit are also played. Upon facing a 3-bet to 11.5 big blinds, the button can opt to 4-bet or call. More often, the choice is to call, thanks to the positional advantage. The 4-betting range is robust, including strong value hands like Jack-Jack through aces and ace-king, along with bluffs at the lower end of the range, such as ace-10 offsuit, king-9 suited, and occasionally a pair of 5s. The button's calling range is comprehensive, covering all pocket pairs, most suited connectors, all suited broadways, some suited aces, and big offsuit broadways, including ace-queen offsuit, king-queen offsuit, and ace-jack offsuit. Moving into the post-flop phase, let's consider a database of 26 example flops to understand the dynamics better. In these scenarios, the overall equity for the small blind averages around 53%. The small blind tends to bet approximately 60% of the time, but this frequency varies depending on the board texture. On certain flops, the small blind bets more aggressively. For instance, on many king-high boards, the betting frequency is quite high, as it is on Broadway boards and 10-high flops. These are situations where the small blind feels confident in their range advantage. However, the small blind bets less often on flops that are more favorable to the button's pre-flop calling range. Examples of such flops are those with 3 low cards, like 5-4-3, 7-6-4, or 9-6-5. These flops are conducive to sets and 2 pairs, which are commonly found in the button's calling range due to their preference for pocket pairs and suited connectors. Similarly, ace-high and queen-high flops with 2 low cards tend to be more favorable for the button, given that ace-queen is a common pre-flop call. When the flops are advantageous for the small blind, they often employ smaller bet sizes, ranging from 10 to 35% of the pot. This is done with a wider range of hands. Conversely, on flops that are more beneficial for the button, the small blind strategy shifts to either betting big and polarized or checking frequently. There's also a tactic of checking strong hands as a means to protect the checking range. In these situations, bet sizes range from 50 to 75% of the pot. If the small blind checks, the button often responds with small bets, typically between 20 to 35% of the pot. Across the 26 different flops in our database, the button bets around 60% of the time when checked to. However, they are more likely to check back on flops that favor the small blind's range. When the button does bet, the small blind's response often involves a check raise, generally around 35 to 50% of the pot size. On monotone boards, both players tend to bet smaller, around 10 to 20%, and the raising sizes are also smaller, often just a minimum raise. In our first example, let's examine a flop of king 6-4 with a flush draw. In this scenario, the small blind adopts an aggressive approach, betting their entire range using multiple sizes. When holding sets, the small blind often opts for smaller bets, around 20 to 35% of the pot. This strategy is designed to protect the weaker parts of their betting range and invites the button to raise, setting up a trap where the small blind can then call the raise, and then check raise, all in on the turn. After making a small bet on the flop, the small blind frequently continues with a small bet on the turn. Analyzing our turn report, we notice that the bet size across all turns varies between 25 to 50% of the pot. The small blind tends to check frequently when a spade hits, signaling a completed flush draw, but bets aggressively on brick turns that don't change the board texture. Hands like pocket queens, pocket jacks, and pocket tens might bet small across all three streets, but they typically avoid going all in on the river. This strategy extracts more value from lower pocket pairs in the button's range. If the button holds a top pair and decides to shove on the river, it becomes a tough spot where calling or folding are both justifiable options. Stronger hands, like pocket aces and strong king X hands, such as ace king and king queen, tend to bet big for value on the flop, around 50 to 75%. This approach puts more money in the pot early to deny equity from potential draws. Sometimes these hands might even go all in on the turn, especially if it brings additional draw possibilities. Bluffing strategies on the flop and turn can involve ace-high hands, which have the potential to outdraw the button's king X holdings. Queen-jack suited and queen-10 suited are also viable bluffs, as they block the button's top-range hands like king-queen, king-jack, and king-10 when a flush completes on the turn, bringing more potential flush draws. A hand like ace-king, without a flush draw, might go all in. This move is a play to realize equity as expected value, especially in situations where the stack-to-pot ratio is small. On turns that bring a second flush draw, sometimes shoving or betting large with a top pair is a good strategy to deny equity. If the turn brings either a board pair or a brick, the typical play with a top pair is to bet around 50% and then go all in with the remaining 33% on the river, even if a flush completes. In our second example, consider a 7-6-4 rainbow flop. This board is particularly advantageous for the button, and here's why. The flop is lower and connected, which aligns well with the button's range of hands they would typically call a pre-flop raise with, such as pocket pairs and suited connectors. In this situation, the small blind tends to play more cautiously, choosing to check at a high frequency of about 76%. When the small blind does decide to bet, they usually go for a larger size, around 75% of the pot. The hands that the small blind might bet with include overpairs like tens, jacks, and queens, often alongside overcard bluffs. It's noteworthy that in this simulation, the maximum bet size on the flop doesn't exceed 75% of the pot. So in reality, a full pot size bet might also be a viable option. When the small blind checks, the button tends to take the aggressive route, betting around 65% of the time with a smaller size of about 20% of the pot. The button's betting range is quite broad, but they are more inclined to check back with hands like ace-high and king-high. If the button bets and the small blind responds with a check raise, hands like pocket eights through queens are often raised significantly, around 75% of the pot. Should the button re-raise all in, these hands are typically quick to call. After the check raise, if there's a call, the small blind often goes all in on the turn with these hands. With sets, the small blind might either check call or opt for a smaller check raise. If the small blind check calls the flop, they frequently lead out donk bet on turns that bring an ace or a king, given that a lot of their flop calling range includes hands with an ace or a king. On most other turn cards, like a jack, the button tends to continue betting, usually around 50% of the pot. Facing such a bet, the small blind's remaining queens and kings might check raise all in frequently. Aces, however, are often played more subtly, trapping, as they block the button's likely ace-x checkbacks on the river. This strategic choice increases the likelihood of the small blind facing a river bet from the button. On turns that don't significantly change the board, the small blind might increase their bet size to about 75% of the pot, aiming to extract more value from the opponent's hands, like ace-king high and ace queen high. In this scenario, the small blind often employs a trapping strategy with aces and kings, as these hands block likely river check downs by the button with hands like ace queen and king queen, thereby increasing the likelihood of the small blind being bet into by bluffs.
Let's examine a third scenario, an ace-9-8 rainbow flop. The small blind holds top pair 34% of the time, while the button does so only at 25% frequency. However, it's important to note that the button's top pair combinations are often stronger, including ace-queen, ace-jack. The button also has two pair hands like ace-9 suited, ace-8 suited, and 9-8 suited, as well as sets with pocket nines and eights. Given this dynamic, hands that want to extract value from weaker top pairs in the small blind's range will often opt for larger bets. If the small blind checks, the button's standard bet is around 50% of the pot size. To counter the button's aggressive betting, the small blind will occasionally check hands like ace-king and ace-queen. Ace-king, in particular, is a high-frequency check-raise hand for the small blind and is prepared to call a 3-bet all-in. When the small blind decides to bet, they typically go for smaller bet sizes, around 10 to 20% of the pot. This approach allows them to extract value from hands weaker than top pair without risking too much against stronger holdings like two pair or sets. The small blind bets quite frequently in this scenario, around 63% of the time. If the small blind bets small, the button is likely to raise at a high frequency of about 14.5%. These raises mostly include two pair hands and sets, but also some strong top pair hands like ace-queen and ace-jack. If the button calls and the turn brings a brick, the small blind will often adopt a split range strategy. With strong hands like ace-king and ace-queen, they might bet big, aiming for a river shove. Conversely, with top pairs or strong pocket pairs like queens and jacks, they might opt for a smaller bet size of around 25%, looking to extract value from weaker pairs and planning to check the river for a showdown. In situations where the flop goes check-check and the turn is a brick, the small blind strategy is similar to the previous line. They might go for large bets around 100 to 150% of the pot, with hands like ace-king, ace-queen, and two pair hands, while betting smaller with other top pairs and strong pocket pairs. Consider the scenario where the turn is a 2, the small blind bets 150%, and the river a 7, completing some straight possibilities. Even then, the small blind might still aggressively shove the remaining 50% of the pot with ace-king and ace-queen. Let's delve into our final example, a very dynamic Jack-10 deuce flop with a flush draw. This wet board is rife with potential straight draws, especially those involving Broadway cards, and numerous flush draws from the button's range of suited connectors and ace-x suited hands. The small blind holds an equity advantage here, primarily due to their higher frequency of Jack-X and 10X combinations, such as Ace-Jack offsuit, King-Jack offsuit, Ace-10 offsuit, and King-10 offsuit, which are less common in the button's range. On such a wet board, we see some aggressive plays, including all-in shoves on the flop for 370% of the pot. The small blind's shoving range here includes hands like Ace-Jack, pocket queens, and pocket kings for value, as well as ace-king, ace-queen, and king-queen as bluffs. Notably, flush draws do not shove all in on the flop. The button's defense strategy involves calling with almost all top pair hands or stronger, and sufficient equity to call most flush draws. However, they tend to fold weaker flush draws and most straight draws, despite their high equity, as they fall short against the ace-high bluffs by the small blind. Regarding other bet sizes, we observe large bets of 50 to 75% of the pot, with two pair hands like Jack-10 suited, stronger overpairs, and weaker top pairs like King-Jack. It's important to note that King-Jack gains more equity on runouts that complete straights, such as a queen or 9 on the turn. On a 9 turn, there's often a check, particularly as king queen completes the straight. Hands like king jack, pocket queens, and pocket kings, which block king queen, might choose to shove or check shove to deny equity from draws, and they have drawing potential themselves if they run into a stronger hand. They also aim to get value from top pair hands. If the turn is a queen, then ace king and 9-8 become straights. But the button has almost no ace king. The small blind then bets 50% of the pot with their new top pair and aims to shove the remaining 33% on the river. Top pair is near the top of the range, and so an alternative strategy might be to check call down, yielding similar results. On a flush completing river, like the 6 of spades, top pair hands and stronger might shove the turn for 120% of the pot to deny equity from flush and straight draws, despite the completion of flushes for suited hands. The button has a flush in their range about 8.71% of the time, which is less significant at a low stack to pot ratio compared to the variety of different draws. The aim of the shove is to convert equity into expected value, ending the hand early when out of position, thus nullifying the positional disadvantage. For smaller flop bet sizes, ranging from 10 to 35%, the small blind employs middle pairs, pocket pairs, and even some stronger hands like top pair and over pairs. These middle strength hands aim to extract value from drawing hands and then navigate to a showdown. On brick turns, a common play is to bet around 50% of the pot, followed by a check down on the river with middle pair or weak top pair. If a top pair takes this line, then a river shove on a brick is a strong play. In conclusion, across these 4 examples, we've traversed a diverse range of board textures and strategic considerations in button versus small blind 3-bet pots, from the equity-rich boards that favored the small blind to the more balanced scenarios where both players had significant play. We've seen how bet sizing, hand selection, and positional play intertwine. The key takeaway is the adaptability required in these situations. The small blind's strategic use of bet sizing, from small value bets to large equity denial shoves, demonstrates a deep understanding of both their own range and the button's likely holdings. Meanwhile, the button's responses, ranging from cautious calls to aggressive raises, underscore the importance of position and the ability to exploit range advantages. Each scenario highlighted the nuanced decisions poker players face, emphasizing that there is rarely a one-size-fits-all approach. Instead, success in these spots requires a blend of mathematical understanding, game theory knowledge, and an adaptable game plan. As we've seen, different board textures can necessitate vastly different strategies, underscoring the complexity and richness of poker strategy.